Since its release in 2001, Brad Anderson's Session 9 has gone on to become a bona fide horror cult classic and is generally regarded as one of the most unsettling horror films of the past 50 years. It is, at its core, a film about a haunting, but unlike classic ghost stories like Shirley Jackson's The Haunting of Hill House, Anderson's film is as much about haunted people as it is a ghost-infested locale. It's this blurring of the lines between madness and the supernatural that makes Session 9 so compellingly creepy and a seemingly perfect companion piece to Stanley Kubrick's haunting adaptation of The Shining. Is there a malevolent force in the film's abandoned mental institution driving the actions of these characters, or are we just watching one man's descent into madness in a creepy yet ultimately benign locale?
Something's not right here.
Grab your scalpels because we're about to perform a postmortem on this modern horror classic in today's episode of Deep Cuts. Horror cinema was in an odd and sort of interesting place in the early 2000s. The slasher boom of the 80s was fading rapidly in the rearview mirror. The postmodernist slasher gold rush started by Scream was finally starting to peter out, although we still got Valentine. Jason Voorhees, for his part, was headed to outer space in Jason X. Amidst all the mainstream titles like Ghosts of Mars, 13 Ghosts, and From Hell were a slew of Asian imports and art house fare like Wendigo and Claire Denis' Trouble Every Day, and a little film called Session 9. Modestly budgeted at $1 million, Session 9 was something of a departure for director Brad Anderson. Before setting out for the abandoned Danvers Mental Institute that would serve as the backdrop for this film, Anderson had helmed rom-coms like Happy Accidents and Next Stop Wonderland. Apparently wanting to shift gears, Anderson teamed up with writer/actor Steven Gevedon to work on a new project. This would be a horror story, loosely inspired by a real-life crime. In 1995, Framingham resident Richard Rosenthal would commit what came to be known as the Burnt Ziti murder. Rosenthal, an insurance executive with a wife and a 4-month-old child, murdered his wife in a fit of rage after she burnt the baked ziti. After doing unspeakable things to her remains, he was eventually captured, went to trial, and sentenced to life in prison without parole. Using the crime as a starting point and the eerily beautiful nearby Danvers Mental Institution as a setting, Anderson and Gevedon started creating what Anderson referred to as, quote, an American tragedy. The results are one of the most fascinating and deeply unsettling genre films of the 21st century. The film's plot is deceptively simple. An asbestos removal team comprised of 5 men are hired to remove the hazardous material from an abandoned mental institution so it can be renovated and repurposed. But things quickly get weird when one of the crew finds an old box of therapy session tapes involving a patient with dissociative identity disorder named Mary Hobbs, and the company boss begins to mentally unravel.
I want to ask you something. Can you forgive me?
Session 9's script wears its influences on its sleeve. It's one part haunted house story like The Haunting of Hill House, one part homage to Kubrick's The Shining, and its cast of men in an isolated locale evokes memories of Carpenter's classic The Thing. There's no shortage of reasons for why Session 9 is a film that will get under your skin. It's a genuinely well-crafted film filled with great performances from an ensemble cast led by Peter Mullen, David Caruso, and writer Steven Gevedon that's filmed in a locale that just feels off. Couple that with Anderson's deft direction and the film's unsettling uncertainty, and you have a genuine horror classic. But why does Session 9 work so well? It's the synergy between the film's themes and overall sense of ambiguity. On the surface, Session 9 is essentially an urban gothic. The decrepit Danvers State Hospital is every bit as imposing as the Overlook Hotel or Hill House, and it's no stretch to imagine that if buildings could be haunted or insane, that this one would be. Had Anderson and his team simply crafted a traditional haunted house film, Session 9 would have probably still been successful. The setting, with its cracked walls and contrasting wide open empty spaces and narrow corridors, just feels wrong and dangerous. But Session 9 wasn't content to let its creepy setting carry the film. Session 9 is as much about haunted people as it is a haunted mental hospital. Like Kubrick's The Shining, Anderson's film is very vague about whether or not there's any actual supernatural presence lurking in the asylum.
It's the monster that lurks deep inside all of us that normally, under most circumstances, never emerges. But because if you're vulnerable, this place will kind of like bring it out and will allow him to emerge.
Unlike Kubrick's film, which eventually acknowledges that there's a supernatural force roaming the Overlook's halls, Anderson never reveals what exactly is going on at Danvers. And the film's final line is so haunting that you'll wind up thinking about it for days.
I live in the weak and the wounded. Dark.
It's this last line that Simon, the film's completely unseen antagonist, lives in the wounded and the weak that caps off Session 9 and leaves us with more questions than answers. But we're getting ahead of ourselves here. Let's talk about the overall vagueness and the tools Anderson employs to make the film so unforgettable. The most obvious place to start is the setting. Anderson scored a huge win when he was allowed to shoot the movie in the Danvers Mental Hospital, because it's arguably one of the most perfect locations for a horror movie I've ever seen. Located just north of Boston, Massachusetts, Danvers State Hospital first opened its doors in May of 1878. First patients wouldn't arrive until almost 2 years later. Danvers was originally built to hold 500 patients, but at its peak, the location held over 2,000 people and was so overcrowded that patients were placed in both the attic and the basement in order to fit them all in. 124 years later, on June 24, 1992, the hospital would close for good thanks to budget cuts. As the film demonstrates, the place quickly fell into disrepair and many things were left behind, meaning the set decoration in Session 9 is largely real. The empty, sprawling husk of a building would be scary enough, but when you factor in how many people passed through Danvers through the years and how many people died inside those walls, well, it takes on an even more sinister persona. It's impossible to look at Session 9 and not see the influence of Kubrick's The Shining in nearly every frame. From the day title cards to the way the set geometry seems at odds with the physical world, to an early scene in a kitchen and so on. But the most obvious example is in Danvers itself. This is the Overlook. If the Overlook had been abandoned and left to slowly go mad and crumble in the solitude of the horrors that happened within its walls. Star David Caruso explains they were only allowed to shoot within a very limited area of the sprawling hospital because of safety concerns. Even with this limited milieu, the place feels huge and menacing. Like the Overlook, Hill House, and even the Amityville Dutch Colonial, Danvers is a character in its own right. It's a foreboding place. Taking that a step further, Danvers is the perfect physical representation of the character's own psychological decay. All of the crew are haunted in this film. Crew leader Gordon by the stress of a newborn and a failing business, along with a sin that will come into focus later. Foreman Phil by his failed relationship. Mike by his failure to finish law school and rise above this menial job that is so beneath him. Jeff by his crippling nyctophobia, and Hank by the futility of this deadly dead-end career path he's on. The decaying, crumbling hospital is not unlike the men sent to clean it. Haunted, damaged, unstable, and maybe very dangerous. The interplay between the physical setting and the character psyches is one of Session 9's masterstrokes. The hospital's labyrinthian corridors and dilapidated spaces mirror the fractured mental states of the crew. It's no coincidence that the film's most chilling moments occur when characters are alone within the sprawling emptiness of Danvers, an isolation that amplifies both external and internal tensions. Anderson crafts a palpable sense of dread by letting silence and ambient sound speak louder than traditional scares. The buzzing of fluorescent lights, the distant echoes of footsteps, and the persistent hum of machinery create a soundscape that feels alive, almost sentient, as though Danvers is watching, waiting, and breathing. This minimalist approach to sound design complements the film's narrative ambiguity. One of the most effective tools Anderson uses to deepen this ambiguity is Mary Hobbs' therapy tapes. These recordings, discovered in the bowels of Danvers, become the spine of the narrative, threading their way through the plot as both a literal and metaphorical device. The tapes detail the sessions of a patient with dissociative identity disorder, her fragmented psyche revealed piece by piece.
Mary got a pretty china doll, and Peter got a big old knife.
Mary's personas, each with its own voice and personality, become a chilling mirror to the unraveling dynamics within the crew. Each tape session builds tension incrementally, starting with Mary's surface-level vulnerabilities before peeling back layers to reveal the ominous emergence of Simon, her darkest identity.
Hello, Doc. Simon.
Simon's voice, calm, cold, and sinister, introduces a malevolent presence that feels almost tangible. His declaration that he lives in the weak and the wounded isn't just a haunting line, it's a summation of the film's themes. The suppressed fears, guilt, and frustrations of the crew echo Mary's disjointed psyche. Gordon's repressed guilt over an unspeakable act, Phil's simmering bitterness, and Mike's intellectual hubris all become fractures that Simon, or whatever darkness Danvers embodies, exploits. As Mary's voice grows more fragmented, so too do the bonds between the crew.
Fuck you.
Each tape session corresponds to a further unraveling of their collective stability, driving the film towards its harrowing climax. What makes the tapes even more unsettling is their ambiguity. Are they merely recordings of a deeply disturbed individual, or does Simon's presence extend beyond Mary, infecting those who dare to listen?
What happened on Christmas night in Lowell?
Use your imagination.
Anderson's restraint in never definitively answering this question is what makes Session 9 a masterpiece of atmospheric horror. Like Kubrick's The Shining, it exists in a liminal space where the supernatural and psychological collide. This lack of clarity is precisely what makes the film linger in the mind long after the credits roll. By refusing to spoon-feed answers, Anderson forces the audience to confront their own interpretations, making Session 9 an unsettling Rorschach test for our fears. Despite being modestly budgeted at just $1 million, Session 9 proved that atmosphere, strong performances, and intelligent storytelling could elevate a horror film above its limitations. Its influence on the genre can be felt in the atmospheric horror resurgence of the 2010s. Seen in films like Robert Eggers' The Witch, Ari Aster's Hereditary, and Jennifer Kent's The Babadook. These films, like Session 9, prioritize mood, character, and psychological depth over jump scares and gore. Moreover, Session 9 showed indie filmmakers that horror can be both cerebral and deeply unsettling, paving the way for a new wave of art house horror. Its use of a real location, the Danvers State Mental Hospital, adds an almost documentary-like authenticity that would later inspire filmmakers to ground their horror in real-world settings and histories. It's a testament to the power of creativity under constraints, offering proof that a modest budget can yield profound terror if wielded effectively. Ultimately, Session 9 lingers because it refuses to conform to horror conventions. It leaves us with questions instead of answers, an unease that festers long after the credits roll. The film's final moments, a culmination of its creeping dread, narrative ambiguity, and psychological depth, are a testament to its unique power. As Simon's voice fades into silence, we are left to wonder, are the weak and wounded doomed to carry their hauntings forever? In the end, Brad Anderson crafted more than a horror movie. He crafted a meditation on guilt, trauma, and the fragility of the human mind. Session 9 is not just a film you watch, it's a film that burrows into your subconscious, unearthing your own fears and anxieties in the process. Over 2 decades later, its potency remains undiminished, a haunting reminder that sometimes the scariest ghosts are the ones we carry within. Ready to perform another postmortem on a horror classic? Then be sure to check out my video on why Kubrick and King disagree so much about The Shining. You'll find a link here on the screen. I'll see you over there.